talking about stuff very easy and laid back. You'd be glad to know I have no Tebow questions. Let's get it out of the way. I do have one Tebow question. Are you tired of talking about him yet?
I'm not. I find him to be a really authentic, interesting guy. And the fact that he has so many loyal followers, to me, makes it an intriguing story for me to cover. And I'm just glad that ESPN picked me to cover it. Here's what I've been able to find out about Tim Tebow. Everybody likes being around him. The players like him. The coaches like him. I was in Cortland for 3.5 weeks at Jets training camp every single day, and everybody got along with him. He got along with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Very unusual, and you're a former pro football player. You know this to be true. It's very unusual for the quarterback to be named one of the top guys in the weight room. And he was voted by his own team as one of the top 3 guys in the weight room.
Yeah.
So you know that he's putting in the work. You know that guys like being around him. And you got to figure that this is a guy who's one of the most popular athletes on the planet, named by Time Magazine one of the 100 most fascinating athletes on Earth, people on Earth. And yet his team has not resented his presence in the locker room,
Mm-hmm.
and they've embraced it.
Yeah.
So that tells you that his personality goes a long way.
Yeah, I mean, I was on Neil Cavuto's show, and he asked me about Tebow, and I said to him, why wouldn't you want a guy like Tebow? He's a competitor. He's a champion. He's got impeccable character.
Yeah.
He's a great influence on your other player. All this stuff, you see it far more than I do. All the bad stuff that's involved with today's athletes. Here you got a shining star who may not be the most aesthetic quarterback in the league, but he's a winner. I mean, he gets it done. He's done it in big spots. I mean, why wouldn't you want to have a guy like Tebow on your side?
Yeah, and he's versatile on the football field. The Jets are going to use him in a multiple personnel groupings on special teams and on offense. He wants to play the linebacker. I asked him, what position do you want to play the most? He said, I'd like to play linebacker or safety. I know, and he's 251 and he's ripped, and he can run like a deer. I mean, you see guys bouncing off him in preseason. They blitz him and they hit him and they just kind of drape right off of his body. I think they have a chance to be good, and if Tebow is used properly, I think they have a chance to be great.
Why do you think the Jets signed him? It seemed like an odd spot for him. A lot of people thought it was a way to knock the Giants off the back page the year they won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think they signed him for 3 reasons.
Yeah.
I think that's one of them. I think it gives them a huge publicity shot after the Giants won the Super Bowl. There's no question that the Jets are in constant competition for eyeballs in New York. And Tebow gives them eyeballs. Mm-hmm. No question about that. 2, I think Tony Sparano fell in love with the Wildcat in 2008 when he ran it with Chad Pennington down there, Ronnie Brown. They ran the most Wildcat plays in NFL history when he was down there in Miami. I think it was 238 plays in a 3.5 year period. They won a division in 2008. Parentheses, Tom Brady wasn't playing that year. He was hurt. So the Dolphins winning the division without Brady on the field is a huge mitigating factor. And I think the third thing is that you can't discount this. He's represented by Jimmy Sexton, who also represents Rex Ryan, also represents Mike Tannenbaum, the GM, and also represents Tony Sparano, the offensive coordinator. So there was a natural background connection among those 4 interconnecting parts with one agent, and I think that had played a significant role.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize that a lot of these coaches and these executives are represented by some of the same people that represents the players, which almost seems like it would be a conflict of interest in some cases for these owners. I wonder if they'll ever change that.
Yeah, I think it can be a conflict of interest, but the players don't seem to be squawking about it too much. I can't really think of an instance where it specifically hurt a star player like a Tebow. But I would imagine that when you have players who are fighting for roster spots, that a coach would give preference to a player where he knows the agent. I mean, you saw it, I'm sure, when you were with the Eagles. Jim Solano comes to mind. I mean, Jim Solano and Dick Vermeil were very close.
Yep.
And Jim Solano had his ear, and I'm sure that influenced not a Harold Carmichael, who's a potential Hall of Fame player, but another player who may not have made the roster, but because of Jim Solano's influence with Dick Vermeil. I think you probably see it now. I don't know of any specific instance, but the Players Association doesn't seem to be squawking about it.
Yeah. Okay, I said no Tebow questions. I've asked you enough about that, so we'll move on to the beginning. You're a Navy guy, first of all.
Yeah.
You retired as a lieutenant.
I did.
And give me some background on that. Did you go to the Navy right out of high school or after you graduated college?
No, I graduated college in 1977 from Oneonta State. I got a full ride to NYU's journalism master's program. Went down, I'm from the New York City area, born in Queens, raised on Long Island. And I went down to NYU, lived in the city for a year, and finished all of the coursework except one course and my dissertation. And I joined the Navy primarily because it was in our family. My uncles were all in the service. My dad was 4F'd because of bad eyesight. And it was kind of preordained that I was going to go into the Navy. Mm-hmm. My uncle Tony was a senior officer in the North Sea during World War II. And he was my godfather, my dad's oldest brother, and he kind of sort of persuaded me at a very young age to be involved, be interested in the military. Mm-hmm. And I studied military history in school. So I went in, I spent 5 years in the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And finished my master's actually when I was out in San Diego, got my degree, my master's degree in journalism. And I was a gunnery officer and a deck officer. I was a surface warfare officer based on 2 ships, the USS Haleakala and the USS Olette. One was an ammunition carrier and the other one was a frigate. And I did 3 tours of duty in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and some duty in East Africa on the ground there in recon, in Ethiopia and Somalia. And got married while I was in the Navy to my college sweetheart, Lynn. And we met in 1976, and we've been together ever since. We just celebrated our 33rd wedding anniversary. And I got out in 1983 and moved back to Albany, New York, where my wife is from.
Right.
And I had the master's degree. I had done very little public relations, only as an ancillary to some of the flag officers in Australia. Very little of that. I was more interested in real military service, but I had a few clips, and I started circulating them around. And the executive editor of the Albany Times-Union, I was living in my wife's mother's basement in Saratoga County, Clifton Park. And the executive editor of the Albany Times-Union is a guy named Harry F. Rosenfeld. And if you remember All the President's Men, Harry Rosenfeld was the city editor of the Washington Post, who hired Bob Woodward out of the Navy. Wow. So I wrote to Harry Rosenfeld and I said, A, I'm not the next Bob Woodward, but B, I just got out of the Navy and I need a job. My wife's pregnant. I'm living in my mother-in-law's basement here in Clifton Park, New York. Can I come in for an interview? And he wound up hiring me.
Before we leave the Navy, you won a Meritorious Service Award.
It was a Meritorious Service Medal for helping supervise the rescue of Vietnamese refugees in the South China Sea. At that time, as you remember, there was quite a bit of upheaval in Vietnam, and people were fleeing the communist government, and they were doing it on, those Marilita boats, similar to what the Cubans do off the coast of Florida. And they were small boats, and there were usually 150 or so more people on them than they could hold, and a lot of them were sinking. A lot of pirates were pressing them into service on merchant marine ships and oil tankers in the South China Sea. So part of our duty was, if we saw them, to pick them up and bring them to the United Nations Refugee Service Center in Singapore. And we found so many of them, it became our mission. and we picked up several boatloads of them and shuttled them to Singapore, and I was part of the supervising crew of that operation.
That's fantastic.
And
Yeah.
we relocated a lot of them. Some of them went to France, some of them went to Texas. I'm sure some of them, have children now who are in college
Mm-hmm.
and are, working, healthy, tax-paying members of American
You
society.
had a hand in that, I'm sure. That
Yeah, it's kind of a neat thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just visited the Naval Academy for the first time. John McGuire, who was the video director for the Philadelphia Stars, who I played for 3 seasons, is now the Naval Academy football video coordinator. So we're doing a documentary on the Stars, titled The Team That Time Forgot. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Stars have the best 3-year record in the history of pro football and still hold the record for most wins in a professional season with 19. And so we're doing...
So that would be 81 to 84?
83 to 85.
83 to 85, yeah. Okay.
So, but the NFL has kind of
83, 84, 85.
expunged all of the record. But again, people forget that we did that against Reggie White and Jim Kelly and Steve Young and it's all the great players that were in the U.S. Joe Cribbs, Nate Newton. I mean, the list goes on and on. So we think it's a good story, and we actually talked.
That is a good story.
ESPN about it, and we've got.
That could be a good 30 for 30.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. We've already filmed almost all of the trailer, and we'll present the trailer to the networks. And but my point was saying that was getting back to the Naval Academy. I get chills walking around that place.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Talk about the sense of pride that a father would have if his son or daughter was attending that academy. I mean, it's just.
I didn't go to the Naval Academy.
Right.
I know
I'm sure you visited there.
I visited there. I went to Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island. But when you go to these academies like West Point or the Naval Academy or the Air Force Academy, you're just blown away by the level of leadership, and camaraderie that they have, and the pride that they have in service is overwhelming.
It's really the essence of our country. I mean, those academies really bring you back to what the United States is all about. So you leave the Navy and you get into journalism, but you get into, I know you started with the Enquirer as a political reporter.
I started with the Albany Times-Union as a political and / investigative reporter. The Times-Union sent me to East Africa to cover the famine in 1985. I wrote a bunch of stories about a guy in the upstate area who was raising money, and there were issues about where the money was going and the aid was going. So Harry Rosenfeld sent me to East Africa. It was a funny story. My wife was pregnant for our second daughter, and this was like February of 1985. She was due in May of 1985, so she was going into the last trimester, and we had a little one at home, a toddler at home, my oldest Zoe. So Harry brings me into the office, and he says, we're sending you to Ethiopia and Kenya. And it was the first time they'd ever sent anybody overseas. It's a small newspaper. Yeah. He goes, you still have your passport? I said, yes, sir. He goes, anything else I should know? I said, well, my wife is 6 months pregnant. He goes, well, you can leave her home. That was that.
How long were you there?
I was there 6 weeks total. And came home just in time for the baby to be born. Yep. And those stories punched my ticket, and I got a job here at the Philadelphia Inquirer. The Inquirer, of course, at that time was considered one of the nation's top two or three newspapers. It had an incredible run. Eugene Roberts was the executive editor, and he was hiring people. They were winning Pulitzer Prizes left and right. And I went from covering the famine in East Africa to covering school board meetings in Medford, New Jersey for the old neighbors sections of the Inquirer. Right. And I got bumped up along the way, and I wound up covering Camden County government here, the Camden County Freeholders race in 1986. Rob Andrews' first political race, I covered it. And covered a Maria Greenwald election against Lee Laskin, Senate election. And I wound up covering the Dawkins Lautenberg race in 1988, and the Florio gubernatorial election in 1989. And it's a funny story. In 1988, I had just finished covering the Senate campaign, and I was getting ready, doing all my research to cover the governor's race. And it was a huge governor's race. Tom Kean was leaving office. There were about 15 Republicans running, and Florio was the unequivocal Democratic nominee here from South Jersey. And it was the day after Christmas. No one's in the newsroom, 1988. I go in, do some research, leave the house, go in early. I'm sitting in the newsroom, and the news editor comes up to me and he goes, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm getting ready to cover the governor's race in 1989 governor's race. And he goes, we need you to go to Pittsburgh and then Chicago and do a story about Mike Ditka. He just had a heart attack, and the Eagles are playing the Chicago Bears in a playoff game. I said, I'm not doing that. You got a million people in sports. Send one of those guys. All right, fine. Hour later, nobody's in the office. It's the day after Christmas. Comes back, he goes, there's nobody here. You got to go. I said, all right, I'll go. But I'm only going to cover this one sports story. I don't want to be pigeonholed into sports. I like being in news. I said, you got a million other Italian Americans over there in sports. You got Cataldi, you got Giuliano, you've got Morganti, you got a million of them. I was the only Italian American in the news department, other than George Anastasia, who was covering the mob.
Who was also a regular contributor to Jersey.
I always read his mob scene. It's great stuff. And so I wind up going to Pittsburgh, Aliquippa, do some research about Ditka, go to Chicago, go to the Chicago Bears facility there in Lake Forest, Illinois, north of Chicago.
My hometown, by the way.
File a story, and the sports editor gets the story and goes, what are you doing? How come you're doing this story? And he liked the story. He goes, you're staying out there and you're covering Buddy Ryan's return to Chicago. I had no clothes. I had to buy clothes. And I stayed out there for a week. I met Buddy Ryan at the airport. I ride shotgun with him in the bus. He rides around Soldier Field, very famous scene, comes back as a hero, as a rock star, back to Chicago, cover the Fog Bowl.
I was going to say that wasn't the Fog Bowl.
That was the Fog Bowl.
It was.
I cover the Fog Bowl, cover that game. Next day, on the front page, New Year's Day. The Fog Bowl was New Year's Eve, 1988. 1989, January 1, is a big picture of Buddy Ryan looking out onto the Soldier Field, seeing nothing but fog, with my byline on it. You can imagine the resentment that caused in the sports department.
Sure.
And from that point on, they conspired to try to get me out of news and into sports. And it took them 4 years after that. After that, I covered the governor's race, and then, of course, the biggest race of all that I covered was the 1991 mayor's race when Frank Rizzo went up against the Republican machine, the race to replace Wilson Good. That was one of the most intriguing, challenging aspects of my career, covering that race.